I'm Russell Lord. I'm the curator of photographs here at the museum, and I'm delighted that you all have come to see our newest exhibition. Some of you have come back to see. Thank you for coming back again. Lee Friedlander in Louisiana, which is one of 3 presentations we have at the museum that looks at the career of one of America's most important living photographers. The other 2 exhibits are in the Great Hall. We have some of his color photographs of American musicians. That work, it's important to keep in mind, was made for hire. That was how he as a photographer made a living before his career as an art photographer took off in the later 60s. And then on this floor, in the 1950s, and the prints that exist from those negatives were made by Lee, initially to show at a major exhibition in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. So he's had a big impact on this city, not only in terms of what he's made in his own photographs, but in terms of the history of photography that he's helped preserve. This exhibition is the biggest of the 3, and it is a 60-year retrospective, as he put it, of a city, as seen through his eyes. And the exhibition is broken up largely into 4 sections. And they are roughly chronological. You'll see it goes back and forth in time a little bit. But we are standing in the room of his earliest work here in the city, and most of the pictures in the city have to do with his interest in music, which was the reason that he came to this city in the first place. He's never lived here permanently, but he's come for extended stays almost every year since 1957. And he first came as an employee of Atlantic Records to make portraits of jazz musicians that found their way onto album covers. And so a lot of the pictures that you're looking at are things that he made in the process of preparing to make those pictures. Images of musicians playing in clubs, or in their homes, or out on the street. So this is a very important part of his career here. However, we're actually going to begin the show talking about this picture right here, which is one of the first pictures that ostensibly doesn't have a real subject. There is no known person in this picture. This is a picture that he made because he wanted to, not because he was working. And this is made in 1959. And we started with this because I think it shows the beginnings of his street photography life and the career that he would become known for, but also because it shows his homage to photographers that came before him. Some of you might know a very famous image by a photographer named Robert Frank of a trolley car in New Orleans. That was a very interesting and important picture, in part because it appeared as the cover of one of the most important photography books ever published in the 20th century. It was called The Americans, and it was based on a trip that Robert Frank took across this country in 1956 on a Guggenheim grant. So Frank's picture of the trolley car, which was straight on, was produced in 1956, but it was not printed or published until 1959. So in 1958, Frank finally got a French publisher for the book, and the following year it was picked up by an American publisher. And what's interesting about the relationship between these 2 pictures is Robert Frank's picture shows a segregated streetcar. There are black sitters at the back of the streetcar and white sitters on the other side. And the streetcar was segregated in 1956 when Frank took the picture. But here, in 1959, when Friedlander made this picture, we see a black woman seated between 2 white men. And most people don't know this, but the streetcars, and I learned more recently, the buses were desegregated almost overnight in May of 1958. So this image that appeared on Robert Frank's book cover, which came out in 1959, already showed a moment that was changing. And we don't really think about this much. This was a revelation to me because nobody has ever written about Robert Frank's picture as being somewhat out of date the moment that it first appeared in the world. But we have to think about this because we associate pictures so closely with the moment that they represent and not with the moment that they actually become effective. There's often this disconnect. So this is a really, I think, important picture, and it's very much up to date on the way that New Orleans was looking. Of course, the rest of the city was still segregated. I want to make no mistake about that. And that's especially important when we look at these pictures, because the pictures that Friedlander made in clubs were things that he had to go very far out of his way to produce. As a white man, he was not allowed to go into many of the black clubs that were producing and playing jazz music, especially traditional jazz. So he often had to secure permits, which he would do through the aid of a man named Dick Allen, who is the man in the center picture on that far wall down there. Dick Allen is a music historian and one of the founders of the Hogan Jazz Archive, now at Tulane. And we borrowed a number of these pictures from the Hogan Jazz Archive. So Friedlander would produce these pictures for the Hogan Jazz Archive to have records of these performances in these clubs. So segregation worked both ways. You know, black people couldn't go into white establishments and vice versa, so you had to secure these permits. Occasionally, I think they would sneak in on their own and make pictures without the permits, but that was a risky endeavor. That's also why a lot of the pictures are very intimate, because they were made in the homes of these artists. That was one place where they were allowed to congregate, or where they were able to congregate. And so you see pictures of that through this show, like, for example, on the end of the wall, we'll talk about it again, but a portrait of Louis Capard, a great jazz guitarist, and that's clearly in his home. You get a sense of the space. Looking at this wall, we wanted to kind of draw or strengthen or heighten the relationship between photography and music, which I have always seen as sharing a special bond. They share the bond of time. A photograph, especially one made with a small portable 35mm camera, which is how Friedlander would shoot most of these, is very fixed in time. It's mobile, you can move it around, and you can snap these pictures in quick exposures that record a very specific moment in time. And of course, music is created over time. It's only through time that we can understand music. And so we hung this wall intentionally like a song. You have the bass drum beginning, and then the horns come in, and then people are dancing in the streets, and then you have onlookers looking back onto what's happening. It's a little bit of a conceit in hanging it this way, but I think it actually approximates the way that Friedlander is moving through the city and working with these people, and it's the way that photographers still work. Second line parades, as we know, are photographed almost ad nauseum today, and you have to be in the mix in order for it to be effective. Friedlander would become best known for his art photographs later on, which often make great use of visually confusing elements in the world. Obstructions, reflections. He intentionally goes to try to find these places in the world that are somewhat disorienting. And one of the things that a lot of younger photographers have told me is that they love Lee Friedlander's work because he did everything that their teachers told them not to do. He intentionally kind of breaks all the rules, and we see a great example of that in this picture over here of Louis Capard, the jazz guitarist that I mentioned. Here he's in Capard's home, and he shows the musician sharply silhouetted against the guitar on the back of the wall. This is something that you are not supposed to do as a photographer. You don't want to line these things up, especially if they might make for a muddy composition or make it look as if something is coming out of somebody else's head. And yet, let's assume for a second that Friedlander knows the rules and is intentionally ignoring them, and ask ourselves why. And this is a question that I want you to ask as you go through the rest of the show. Why would he do this? Well, could it be that he's trying to align the tool of the trade with the person who plays it? This is a picture about a guitarist, and that is clear. And as we know, most musicians think of their instrument as a kind of appendage. You know, it becomes a part of them. They have it with them at all times. Friedlander is very interested in the way that a photograph collapses space. A camera is monocular in its vision, so planes get reduced to a flat plane, and he knows that, and he's intentionally kind of playing with that here. So as we go through this exhibit, I hope you'll think of these pictures as being both artful and documentary. And it's a very careful line to walk, because it's hard to do both, and yet that, I think, is very much the spirit of Lee Friedlander. One of the more kind of documentary but very humanistic pictures in the show is this really beautiful picture from 1970. This is from the very first Jazz Fest, and this is a portrait of Mahalia Jackson with a member of the Eureka Brass Band. And this is documenting a very famous moment at that first Jazz Fest when Mahalia, who was scheduled to perform later that night, came out and saw what was going on with the Eureka Brass Band and kind of joined in the festivities. And this is an important moment because Mahalia was a gospel singer, and she was a true, devout Christian gospel singer. And there was a divide between gospel and jazz music, right? I'll credit Brian Piper, who is the co-curator of the show in the back there. He's our Mellon Fellow for Photography. He said that there's a thin line between Saturday night and Sunday morning. And here you have these things collapsing, but so much of the great music tradition that exists here in the city is about blending different traditions. Jazz itself, obviously, is a blend of cultures and styles that kind of coalesced here. So this is a really, I think, wonderful picture. And Mahalia would pass away in 1972, so this is a really kind of wonderful document towards the end of her life, but at the beginning of what we know as Jazz Fest. Let's go into the second room and look at some